This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we are excited to welcome Kirsten Powers. Kirsten is a New York Times bestselling author, USA Today columnist, and senior political analyst for CNN, where she appears regularly on Anderson Cooper 360, CNN Tonight with Don Lemon, and The Lead with Jake Tapper. Her writing has been published in The Washington Post, Elle, The Daily Beast, The Wall Street Journal, and many more publications. Kirsten's book, Saving Grace, Speak Your Truth, Stay Centered, and Learn to Coexist with People Who Drive You Nuts, was released in 2021. Kirsten discusses her book with us with incredible honesty. This is a book that is a must-read in these deeply divided days.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. My name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
And you're listening to Kevin George as well as Rob Henderson. I'm the priest at St. Aidan's Anglican Church up in the northwest corner of said same city, London, Ontario.
And my name is Ian. I'm a producer. Let me try that again. My name is Ian, and I'm a producer and the person who sends this podcast out into your ears. How are you doing? Hope you're having a good day.
Yeah. All right. We are back and happy to be back for our sixth season of the Vickers Crossing, and we continue on our eighth episode, but who's counting, guys, really? Wow. And today, for our eighth episode, we are really excited to be talking to a wonderful guest here. We're chatting today with Kirsten Powers. And if Kirsten's name perhaps rings a bell to you, it probably should, because she is a New York Times bestselling author, USA Today columnist, a senior political analyst for CNN. You might have seen her on shows like Anderson 360, Anderson Cooper 360, Don Lemon's show on CNN, Jake Tapper's show, The Lead on CNN. And she's also been published in the Washington Post and Elle magazine and the Daily Beast and the Wall Street Journal and many more.
She's everywhere, man. She's everywhere.
She's been around with all of her writing and her work. And she's got a new book coming out now, which is called Saving Grace, Speak Your Truth, Stay Centered, and Learn to Coexist with People Who Drive You Nuts.
Yeah, we need that.
And boy, do we ever. So it was actually released a little while back, but we're going to be chatting about it today because we finally got a chance to catch up to Kirsten. And anyway, so looking forward to seeing her.
Yeah, I'm just so excited about having her on. What's cool is she's interacted or sort of been working along with as well people like Diana Butler-Bass, and Father James Martin, and Richard Rohr, and a bunch of others that we've have had out. Brian McLaren, past guest on this podcast. So.
Those names sound familiar.
Yeah. We've talked to these people, so it's only appropriate that we talk to Kirsten Powers as well. So looking forward to that. Before we go any further, we will do our land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that the lands upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples, connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of creation and people with whom we wish to work towards wholeness and reconciliation for all God's people.
And guys, hey, we love doing the podcast and enjoy it, but there are those that support us in this endeavor, and we couldn't be doing it without their support. And those are our wonderful sponsors. So we want to say hello and thanks to them today. First, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And our thanks to Dave Mullen and the entire staff at A. Miller George Funeral Home today.
Yeah, and we want to do a shout out as well to Carol Basada up at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, locally everything. So go see her and get your drugs over there.
And last but certainly not least, we want to say a huge thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Tricia Lister was the wonderful human being who hooked us up with that. So thank you to them over there.
Awesome.
Awesome. All right. So Kirsten's going to be joining us shortly. But before we do that, we're going to look ahead a little bit. Yep. And it's time for the next segment on the Vickers Crossing, which we like to call, Hey, Kevin, who the heck did you book this week?
Well, am I ever glad you asked, Rob? Drum roll, please. Well, with a great drum roll like that, how can I not help but announce that I'm excited because we have booked Dr. Karen O'Donnell. We're going back across the pond, fellas, back over to the United Kingdom, feminist theologian specializing in trauma theology. She's program leader of the MA in Christian Spirituality at Sarum College, which is such an incredible place. And Dr. O'Donnell has a great book out called Dark Womb. And it sort of picks up on some of the work that Dr. Danielle Tumamino Hansen, who we had on a little while ago around surrogacy, a little bit of a different thing, but in that same field. And I saw Dr. Tumamino Hansen tweeting about Karen, and I saw it and I reached out to her and she was like, yeah, I want to be on the Vickers Crossing podcast too. So very excited to be having Dr. O'Donnell join us to talk about her just released book, Dark Womb.
All right. And we're going to talk about saving grace with today's guest, Kirsten Powers. And we're going to do that right about now, I think.
All right. Come on in, Kirsten.
And we are so happy today to welcome Kirsten Powers to the Vickers Crossing podcast, the author of Saving Grace. And Kirsten, we're so happy that you could take some time with us to talk about the book and other things. And we hope you're well. How are you holding up down there?
I'm great. And I'm really excited about this conversation.
Good. Well, we're glad you're here.
Would it be appropriate to ask the question, what's life like in Washington? You are in Washington. Right?
Well, I mean, they just yesterday lifted the mask mandate. So we're kind of getting back to normal, I guess. And the cases are really low in DC. So that's really good. I do think people are, it's interesting. I think people are having a hard time letting go of the masks. I went to mass yesterday for Ash Wednesday and, hundreds of people in the church, and the sign said, you don't have to wear a mask unless you want to. And I'd say there were like maybe 2 people in the church not wearing a mask.
Really? Wow.
So I think people are having it's a hard mental shift to make.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting moving forward because our government's announced in our province that the masks might come off by the end of this month even, but everybody I'm talking to says no.
Yeah,
it's funny. I actually said in my sermon last Sunday that talking about how, because we're starting now to lift, because we still had restrictions on numbers and so on here, but I was saying to our people about how we trusted the health officials going into this, and do we trust them now to get us out of it, or have we all become experts in the meantime? Because I feel like that's a little bit of what's going on, is we know just enough to be dangerous now. So now it's like, well, now they're telling us to get back to it. It's like, really? Do you know though? Do you know? So, anyway, listen, to get started, we wanted to ask you about your own faith journey. I mean, obviously a lot of what we do on here is talk about the intersectionality between faith and the public square. And one of the people I've admired for a long time is you, for the work you've been doing very much in the public square, because I think while we may see you on Anderson Cooper 360 or on Don Lemon's program, and you may not be talking about what you did in church on Sunday, what you are doing by the very way you comport yourself and the issues you get called into because of the difficult nature, particularly of things being so fractious nowadays. I've long admired just how you really live out your faith in very difficult and sometimes trying circumstances. You've written and spoken in other places about your journey from being an atheist to being a Catholic, with a somewhat painful decade as an evangelical in between. I wonder if you can share some of that journey with our listeners.
It's a really long story. I've tried to figure out how to truncate it, but yeah, it's I grew up in my parents are academics and they're archaeologists. They taught at the University of Alaska, and they were mostly atheists when I was young, I guess. Not that you really were really talking about it when I was 6 years old, but church wasn't really a part of our life. And then my dad at some point decided we should start going to church. And I found out later that this was more about, he just thought that's what good parents do. They take their kids to church. Yeah. It wasn't so much that he had this like on fire faith. But I thought that he did. Right. So we went to an Episcopal church, and my mom's side of the family is Catholic. My parents got divorced when I was 5, and she walked away from it when she went to college and has never gone back. And I think is an atheist. I think that's how she described herself even today. So that's kind of the environment I grew up in. I had a kind of faith-ish, I believed in God, but by the time I got to college, I just was like, this isn't adding up. It doesn't really fit with what I was taught, because I had a very basic, understanding of God, and it fell apart pretty quickly. And then, of course, I went to my father, and he was like, yeah, I never really believed in it.
That's
it's
right.
like, what?
It was fake.
We're just all going through the motions, okay?
So that was really caused an existential crisis for me, because when I would think about it and panic, I'd be like, well, my dad believes this and he's brilliant, and then it was like, then it turned out he didn't. The truth was, he was a seeker, I think, in hindsight. And he did kind of come back to it. He unfortunately died when he was 61, suddenly of a heart attack, but he had just started looking for a church. So I think he was always kind of seeking. He very much wanted to believe, but as a scientist, he had a hard time. And especially, I just don't think there was as much available as there is to us today, right? In terms of finding people who are pretty sophisticated and could talk about faith in a pretty sophisticated way. So I kind of wonder what he would be today. But at any rate, I then became an atheist, and sort of went back and forth between agnostic and atheist. And then I ended up dating somebody who attended an evangelical church in New York City. This was after my dad died. And I write about this in my book. I had a series of, I have a pretty small family, and my dad died, my grandmother died, my stepfather died. It just was like this onslaught, and I was in a very bad place. And I started going to church, and I got quite deep into the evangelical world, and it wasn't a really good experience for me. This isn't to say that other people don't have good experiences, right? I'm just saying, for me, it was not a good experience. And so I ended up I'd always felt drawn towards Catholicism, because my grandparents were Catholic. My mom's whole side of the family is Catholic. I attended a Jesuit high school, so it was always kind of there in the background. And so I started. Do you know Father Jonathan Morris, or have you ever heard of him?
Yes, I know the name. I do indeed.
Yeah. So I knew him through work, and we used to go to dinner. We were friends, and we would talk theology, and he'd always say, you're Catholic, right? And I just would be like, what? And so
you're a closet Catholic.
Well, the more it's just, I was naturally thinking theologically that way, right? It wasn't, and I didn't realize that. And so I was always having this conflict with evangelical theology. And so I started to I really need to investigate this. And so I did. And end of the story is I became Catholic. So that's sort of how I ended up there. And even since then, it's still been a real journey, I think, where I have, just have these moments of like, this is just like the worst institution on the planet. I mean, it's not easy. And so, yeah, there's a lot of struggle, I feel like, in this, trying to be a Christian in the United States.
Well, there's all the white nationalist stuff that gets mixed in there, right? So,
yeah,
but I think the fact that you're able to say that is difficult is what makes you what I would call a good Catholic. My wife, Catherine Ann, is a Roman Catholic and works in the Roman Catholic Church, has her master's in divinity, chaplain in the Navy, all that sort of stuff. And so we go through this all the time because, of course, here I am, what you folks would say, an Episcopalian priest. She's a Roman Catholic chaplain.
Yeah.
But part of, I think, what makes her, what impresses me about her faith is the way she's willing to wrestle with all of the difficulties that go along with living in that.
Well, and I do feel like, as compared to my experience in the evangelical world, even in the Catholic Church, it feels like that is really embraced. And there's a lot of tension in the Catholic Church, between different groups of people who believe different things, right? And they all have a seat at the table, the Jesuits versus the Dominicans in terms of how they may see things, for example, but they're all equally Catholic, right? Whereas in the evangelical world, it doesn't really operate that way. It's just you either are this or you're out.
There's a lot of black and white.
There's just and so that is one thing that's nice, that it's it's what makes you Catholic is that you're Catholic. Like, you were baptized Catholic, you were accepted in the Catholic Church, you were confirmed, you're Catholic, and then there's a real wide variety of views, and the mystery is really embraced. Conscience is embraced. And so, and then there's all sorts of horrible things about it.
Well,
so,
we live that tension in our own church, and we're both paid by it. So I mean, we're like, so look, let's get into this fantastic book, Saving Grace. And it's out now, I guess, coming up on 2 years, right? So, because it's 2022.
Oh, no, it just came out at the end of last year.
Okay, so I was mistakenly thinking it was 2020 for some reason. It's the COVID brain.
I know, everything blends together. It feels like, I know, it's like, no, it just came out at the end of last year.
Soon, obviously, then, if it's been out that little bit, soon to be available in paperback, probably, right?
Yeah. We're trying to figure out what the date is, but it will be out in paperback.
If I can encourage you to go buy it as a hardback. Don't wait. It's good. It's a good book. You want to have it in your shelf. So, in Saving Grace, you lay out at the outset just how much you yourself needed to embrace grace after the fallout from that 2016 election that you guys had over there. And we watched it like the crazy. We just think we got crazy neighbors, right? But we got our own crazy now. We have trucker convoys. We got it all going on now. We all have crazy now.
Here come the Canadians.
So you say you started to see people not as complex human beings, but rather as a sum total of their behavior or beliefs, and you began to see that as enraging, as so many of us do. That you fixated on what you believed about them and what you believed about yourself, which led to seeing those you were disagreeing with on TV as terrible or badly intentioned selfish people, and yourself as good or well-intentioned, concerned about others. This automatic judgment, you say, led you to feel contempt and scorn, and at times hatred. I think we can all identify. And so you make clear from the get-go that you needed this conversation about grace as much as you wanted to write about it for anybody else. And so I just want to share a little excerpt from the book and a question on the other side. You begin the book by talking about grace and what Philip Yancey calls on grace. And Philip Yancey was on the podcast actually not so long ago with his new memoir, incredible book. So I'll read this small excerpt here. You write, true grace is otherworldly. It goes against every instinct we have to seek revenge for wrongs, or to shame or humiliate people who have acted immorally or unethically. It is what the theologian Dorothy Solé, who grew up in Nazi Germany, calls borrowing the eyes of God, which I absolutely love. It enables us to see the divinity in every person, no matter what they've done and what they believe or who they voted for. Grace is giving other people space not to be you, which I really like. You go on to say, with respect to the on grace, it's something we love to receive, but often the last thing we want to offer. Instead, we incline ourselves to what Philip Yancey calls on grace, withholding that which the world desperately needs. We become the prodigal's older brother, glowering in the background, jealous and fuming about how undeserving his younger brother is of his father's reflexive affection and forgiveness. Grace has become the lingua franca of our discourse more often than not. It's the lens through which we view people who don't share our religious, political, or moral values. Those people may be our leaders, our coworkers, our neighbors, or increasingly members of our own families. You go on to describe on how good days you could limit your negative feelings about those who you felt were causing so much harm or disdain. And on the worst days, as you say, you hated their guts. But feeling hate, like being unforgiving, you point out, it consumes us, right? Like it eats us up inside. Can you say more about this contrast between grace and ungrace, and why grace is so much more critical for us now than ever?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have a lot of resistance to this idea, understandably, because I think there's so much confusion about what grace is. And so people will think, oh, you mean just letting people do whatever they want and being a doormat and kind of rolling over. And it's like, well, if that's what grace was, then I would think it was a pretty bad idea.
Yeah.
But that's not what grace is. And so it's a very countercultural, paradigm shifting idea, a way to think about things that I think we don't normally, like a thought process we don't normally go through, even Christians. And, I use also, I use basically two definitions. One is the one you just mentioned, grace is giving people space to not be you. That's more like the secular, for people who aren't believers, because the book is for everybody.
Sure.
But the Christian definition, and I don't think you have to be a Christian to adopt this definition. I mean, look, I read a lot of Buddhist books and I use a lot of their language, but I'm not Buddhist. So the Christian definition is paradigm shifting, which is unmerited favor. And we live in a country where we think everybody has to earn everything.
Right.
And so the idea of saying, no, they just get it because you see the humanity in them. If you're a believer, you see God in them, you see the divinity in them. They don't actually have to do anything to get it. And so I feel like that really shifts the way we think about things, because so often, even when I was first, I was writing the book, and my friends would be like, well, I mean, I can see having grace for the person who like basically shares all your values, but then does something stupid. And it's like, but that's not really grace, right? Because you just came up with a reason that you gave it to them. And that's not, you're not really just saying, hey, you did something that I find absolutely atrocious. And yet I still am going to look at you and see you as a person. And you may need to be held accountable for what you did. It doesn't mean you're not accountable. It's just that I'm not going to hold you in contempt. I'm not going to dehumanize you. I'm not going to other you, which is, if we're being honest, what we usually do.
Right.
We don't usually take the time. Yeah. And then we're the ones who ultimately, usually we're the ones that suffer the most. Sometimes we are causing suffering for other people, but most of the time, most of us aren't going up to the person and saying, like, I think you're worthless, right? That's not what's happening. Now, sometimes we see it in like social media mobs or something, right? But in most of our lives, like we're just consumed by it. It's eating us up inside, and it's making us miserable. And so, it's why like judging is, the opposite of grace. The minute you judge somebody, you now have become completely intertwined with them, right? Because versus being discerning and looking at somebody and saying, I see this and it's a problem, and I'm going to tell you why I think it's a problem, but like, it's yours. It's not coming with me. Right. Whereas I used to be like, I'd take it and then I'd go home with it and I'd lay in bed and I'd stew with it. And then that person and, and talk to everybody about it. And it's like, no, I don't need to do that. And it doesn't help anybody. It hurts me. It doesn't change them. It doesn't change the problem. It's just, all of it is just, it's a mess. And if anything, it makes the problem worse.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, we carry our own baggage. Why do I need to carry that baggage? I don't want that baggage. Right. Yeah. It frees you. It frees you. there's I think a bit of an impediment to grace, which can often be our dualistic thinking, which is really, that's so prevalent in our culture right now. We're just obsessed with kind of this binary thinking in our culture. You're right or you're wrong, you're good or you're bad. In Canada, we had, I love the truckers, I hate the truckers. There's nothing in the middle, right? But you point out that the all or nothing paradigm is a default for many. And it becomes even more when we're under duress, and you either completely embrace or excuse other people's bad behavior and beliefs, or damn them to hell. You're with me or not. So you share a story in the book about how your own awareness of how this hyper dualism has been distorting your thinking and bringing misery into your life, as you mentioned a bit. And it was 2017, and in addition to your fury of what was happening in the political world, you were having a spiritual crisis. And two priests that you mentioned, which when I read them, I thought, wow, that's fantastic.
These are good
we
people.
have great respect for these gentlemen. James Martin, one of them that we were able to talk
Friend
to.
of the podcast.
A little while ago.
He's wonderful.
And Richard Rohr, who I read all the time. But they kind of help pull back, the frame a little bit through things like contemplative prayer and embracing of mystery, just to see how this dualism affects your own religious life, your spiritual life. I'm wondering if you can share some of that, that episode with our listeners, and how meaningful that was for you.
Yeah, I think that when I first, so Jim Martin is my spiritual director. And when I first, for my very first spiritual direction, I basically just showed up just, enraged about the Catholic Church, and I'm done and I'm out, and I can't take it anymore. The patriarchy, the this and that. And it just really not in a good place, and not in a good place about Christianity. And he just really pulled me back into like the basics, right? And so one of the things he said to me was, when you experience God, how do you experience God? Like, how have you traditionally, experienced God? And I said, what is it? What do you feel? And I said, I feel peace. And he's like, so maybe this isn't God. Like what you're doing right here, And so I was like, and so I knew that intellectually that was true. I was like, that's true. Like, I'm not, look, people do come to these conclusions about the Catholic Church, and that's totally valid. And I respect that. But you do want to make sure you're doing it from a place of being grounded and clear. And I was just all over the place. And then it was, through reading Richard Rohr, I did do a retreat with Richard, and then working with Father Martin, of becoming aware of, I had this propensity of really, there wasn't a middle ground. It's just, if I feel this way about the Catholic Church and the things that they have done that I think are evil, I think in terms of, the pedophilia, things that had happened, the fact that it's so patriarchal, that I have massive problems with, then there's only one answer, right? Versus maybe there's not just one answer, maybe there's many answers. And, and also, what's the emergency, right? It's like, maybe you could just sit with this and take some time and, and really discern and figure out whether this is where you're supposed to be. And maybe you're supposed to be here for a reason. Maybe you are going to be a person who speaks up about these things because you care about this, right? And so I'm still in that process, I would say. But it was, it was, I realized that, like, I just didn't see any other way than, like, you just had two choices: you're in or you're out.
Right.
And and it's not, and I think that that's the way our political system in the United States is designed also. It's like, you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, right? And it's just, one is good and one is bad. And even independents, like 10% of independents will switch voting between parties. The rest of them will always vote for the same party. So it's, so you see how everyone's being pushed into these really extreme positions, because there's just no way that there could be two parties that would represent everything that a person feels. It's not possible. But so all of the conversations we have are built around these, like, very binary, ways of seeing things. It's just, you see it going on with Ukraine right now, where it's like
Sure.
either we have a full-scale war or we're doing nothing, and it's just like, no, there's all sorts of other things in the middle, right? And so, you have some people from the right just pushing for like so much more intervention from the United States. Like there's just, and if you don't do what we say, then you're weak. It's like, but there's all sorts of different things in between those things. Those are false choices. And so I lived in the world of false choices and was always having to make my decisions between false choices. And I think that, and I think we're all, look, our brains are kind of naturally designed to do that anyway, because it's a way that gives us some clarity, but it's really meant more for, it's a little more like more primitive things. Like I see, a tiger coming towards me. What am I supposed to do? I have two choices, right? You know what I mean? Or I see a tribe of people that I don't recognize, and I've got to make a really quick decision. Are these people that are going to harm me, or are they people that are not going to harm me? Like those are not the kind of decisions most of us are making on a daily basis. And so, it's like our lizard brain, right? And so that takes over. Then we're in already a very binary system. Our educational system is very binary. Western thinking is very binary. And then if you have any trauma, which I had a ton, most people have at least a little. If you're traumatized and you get triggered, go on Twitter. I mean, it's just, it's people who are being triggered and then going into binary thinking, because that's what gives you a sense of safety and control. Right. And that you're seeing it clearly. And then if you say something, if you try to be nuanced, a lot of times it's like, you're just a cop out. You're not seeing it clearly. You're not having moral clarity. This is the kind of what you get when you try to be nuanced.
Right. And it makes it worse in social media and stuff, because, never mind that the algorithms are pushing you toward that side that you need to go to, that they want you there. So what choice do you have? You're being controlled like that, not even knowing it. Right. It's really difficult, but the other thing is too, I wanted to ask you about, because bring about this idea that, grace can actually run out, and you examine a little bit what happens with that, when grace can no longer be offered, and that happens, and there are consequences. Those who suffer the consequences are quick to say, well, what about grace? Shouldn't be always be giving grace. There's, there's a great deal of pearl clutching over the so-called cancel culture right now, certainly. And you're right about this. And I just want to offer a little quote for our listeners from the book. You write that people cry, "Why are you canceling people? Why are you overreacting to this one little thing? What about grace?" But so much grace has been extended and for so long, but at some point, a grace period ends, and you can be late with your mortgage payment by a week, but you can't be late by a month. There's going to be a late fee. And after 3 months, your mortgage could be canceled, and you might even lose your house. So it is with issues that have been explained ad nauseum for generations to people who have refused to listen. The grace period for racism, misogyny, and bigotry is over. Done, right? Amen. Yeah. And you're right. I didn't decide that. I'm merely observing reality. As you go on to assert that, grace is not a get out of jail free card, and it's not a weapon to be wielded to excuse or erase failures. To believe either of these things is to make a mistake. Can you say more, maybe, Kirsten, about, the limits of grace, because they're definitely there.
Yeah. And even like, I think that I still think like in those circumstances, you could use like sort of the paradigm of grace in how you hold people accountable. But the way a lot of times people, because sometimes grace is getting off scot-free, right? Sometimes like people do say like, you know what, you totally screwed up, but it's the first time, you're sorry, I'm gonna, or even if you're not sorry, I'm gonna look the other way, right? But usually in these so-called cancel culture situations, because I delved into a lot of them, it's usually not the first time. No, that's the thing. Like what you end up finding out is that actually in this organization, this person had been confronted before. And, there's a lot of like, you start to see like, wow, there actually was a lot of grace. And this person just kept blowing through it. And now that they've lost their job, they're saying like, I'm, cancel culture and I didn't get any grace. And it's like, but you did. And you just took it for granted.
Yeah.
Because when the people told you they were offended about you saying the N-word, you like blew them off, and then you kept pushing through it, right? And so it's not a lack of grace when people finally say no. You know, it's not a lack of grace, frankly, if you said it one time and Black people say, you know what, it's 2023 or 2022, you know, or, you know, when I wrote the book 2021. And at this point, like, how much longer are we supposed to be extending
Right,
this to
exactly,
you? You know what I mean? Like at some
exactly,
point, like you're just not paying attention, and it's like, we're over it, you know?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's like, you have to take responsibility. And, you know, I'm not saying, like, I'm not a person who says, you know, if somebody loses their job for doing something that they shouldn't have done, that it's not a big deal. I think it's a really big deal. Like, I would never be somebody that's like, oh, they'll be fine, they'll find another job. No, I mean, getting fired from a job is a big deal. Sometimes it's necessary. I do think if people were better at taking responsibility and were truly repentant, that they would be probably surprised at what a different reaction they would get, right? If when it happened, they said, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I did that, and I'm so ashamed, and I want to do better, and I'm gonna go talk to people to find out how to do better, and you know, that kind of things. We don't see that a lot.
No,
I
wonder actually.
We see defensiveness and justifications.
Yeah, I just actually, as I was listening to you say that, I was thinking about this recent episode with Whoopi Goldberg, right? Like it's this really difficult reality where, you know, she at first was not really, it wasn't really repentant. The first thing was, well, what I was trying to, she went on Colbert, and then it got muddier. It got muddier and not cleaner. Am I?
Yeah. Well, and there's also, you'll see a lot of times people will say, people should know that I'm not like that, or people should see all the things that I've done for them, or people should see all the people that I've stood up for. And it's like, but that doesn't give you a right to to harm people. And it is harmful when you say things that you know, are harming large groups of people. It doesn't make you a horrible person. It doesn't make you rotten to the core, any of those things, right? I think that, and that's the problem. Like, if people could have some humility and just be like, look, I screwed up, and you know, and I'm going to take time to educate myself and make sure that this doesn't happen again. And because this is serious, and it's not on other people to cut me slack because I've done other good things. Right. And that's what we see a lot. And then people abuse the idea of grace, which is why I think grace is kind of a word that's become a little toxic, because people are like, oh yeah, I know that. Grace is what I was told in church when I complained about misogyny. I was told, have grace for the priest. He doesn't know any better, you know, or whatever. And it's like, no, the priest needs to learn and do better, you know. And it's like, and so that's the thing of saying, like, that is not grace.
Right.
That's enabling.
Well, and you make the point too, as you just said, like, it really doesn't matter if you intended it or not, right? Like, you quote Charles Blow in there. Right. And I'm just forgetting the quote, but it's that it really doesn't matter if you intended to hurt somebody or not. Once they've been hurt, and if you're a caring, responsible human being, then an apology is an apology. It's not oh, I'm sorry if I hurt you.
I think that that's the other problem, is the way people apologize is often very defensive. And it's much more focused on the fact that they're hurt, that they've been accused of doing something bad, than that they've hurt somebody else. And so, you know, to say like, well, that's not what I intended it to be. I intended it to be something different. A better apology is, I did this thing, and I am sorry for my behavior. I'm not sorry for how you feel about my behavior. I am sorry for my behavior.
That's right.
This is hard.
It is hard.
You know, it's hard.
And you can say, I can be, but I know I can be better, but I know I can do better. Right. And I'm going to, that's my responsibility now, and be a picture of what that looks like to the folks. Right.
And intent matters in the sense of course, it's worse if you intended to hurt people. And it certainly matters as a matter of law. It might even matter in terms of people deciding whether how much of a punishment you should, you know, receive for what you did, but it doesn't mitigate harm. Right. It's like the harm happened whether you intended for it to
Yeah,
happen.
I think at
And
one
so,
place, I was going to say, I think at one place in that chapter, you say it's often much better when people tell on themselves.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Right.
When you come to the realization on your own,
Yeah.
and you take the time to reflect and say, oh, yeah, which I actually saw a lot of my male friends doing during Me Too, though I do also think they were kind of, feeling like, oh, maybe they're going to come for me, so I better start looking at my own behavior. Like, I wish that they would have done it prior to Me Too,
Sure.
but at least they did it. At least they sat and thought, like, did I ever do this? Was I ever too pushy with a woman? Or, these kinds of things that people weren't really doing before. And so, yeah, so I have a hard time a lot of times when I see these things, and I just think, especially since 2020, you just think, well, where have you been? I don't that you think that this is gonna fly, and it's a real sense of, you have to be extremely privileged to think that you can talk that way and have nothing happen to you, and that people aren't going to be upset. So, I feel like people are going to make mistakes. I make mistakes. I say things that I shouldn't say. Things come out wrong. But I think that, I try to take responsibility for it.
Sure. One thing we talked about a lot on our podcast is that the pandemic, the George Floyd, the Breonna Taylor, like all that stuff, that's lifted a veil.
Yeah.
That those of us certainly that have, white privilege and we're seeing things before, like the veil went up and we went, whoa.
Yeah.
Right. And so now's the time to say, I didn't realize that I was speaking that way, or that those words were wrong. And once that veil goes up, like, you can't put it back down.
It's very apocalyptic.
Yeah. But a lot of people just sailed right through that and just
sure. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Didn't read a single anti-racism book, didn't watch a single YouTube, just are like, I'm just going to keep doing my thing. And then they're shocked when something happens. And it's just like, wow, that must be amazing. I don't even know what it's like to live like that. I really don't, as a woman. Like, I don't, there was one big case I talk about in the book, that involved a New York Times writer who had said something, he'd used the N-word, and it's a long story, but there were so many takeaways from it. But one of them was he was literally told by his bosses at the Times to apologize, and he wouldn't do it. And I'm like, I don't even understand a world where I get to tell my boss that I'm not I'm not apologizing for something that caused harm to people. They're upset. And has embarrassed the New York Times and has upset my colleagues, and I think I'm going to keep my job. Like, what world is that? I'm just like, I don't. Well, and that's a world of like entitlement, of where you have always been able to kind of do what you want, and then when he ultimately got fired, then he was the victim of cancel culture, and it's like, you could have stopped this whole thing just by apologizing.
Hey, look, I saw it just on Sunday. There was as there are in every city right now, there was a large rally for Ukraine downtown at what's called Victoria Park here. And in order to get there, we had to go by a congregation of so-called trucker convoy people talking about their freedoms. Right. And it's and I just stop and I think, what world are you in? What world are we living in now, where there's a group of people on one side of the park talking about having to wear a mask, which is all being lifted right now anyway. And while people are gathering on the other side because they've got family in Ukraine who are having bombs dropped on them right now, and people in Russia who are getting arrested in the streets for trying to stand up to this terrible dictator. Like, I don't know the world we live in anymore. But anyway,
it's quite upside
I digress. In having said that, and picking up on what you just said in a way, the other chapter I found great was you said people are not disposable. So, I really like that, because you make the case that so many people have been discarded or scapegoated or jailed, often to satiate our own guilt or our own complicity in all these societal ills. And a brief quote from the book: it seems to me, you write, that allowing a portion of grace into our world might temper the graceless and overtly simplistic do the crime, do the time mentality with which many of us have been indoctrinated. It might pull us out of the divisive us versus them paradigm and help us to start seeing each other with empathy and as multidimensional human beings who are not disposable. We have to choose to be different kinds of people if we want to have a different kind of country. That is as true here in Canada, by the way, as it is in the United States. Demonization, domination, and dehumanization got us into this mess. Grace might just lead us out of it. You know, I got to say, I was particularly taken by the beginning of that chapter because you share a story of inmates in a federal jail who ostensibly saved the life of one of the guards. Would you perhaps share that story? And can you say more about how this propensity we have towards writing people off or disposing of them is having such a deleterious effect on our current culture and society, because everything is just take it or leave it?
Yeah, it was a YouTube that was, just beyond viral. And of some inmates, the guard had passed out, and they basically all started just banging, trying to make as much noise. It was late at night, I think, and just doing everything they could to wake him up. And then at some point, I think he just came to consciousness. He didn't have a heart attack, but he had some sort of episode with his heart where he lost consciousness. And he woke up just long enough to make eye contact with one of the inmates and push the button to let him out. And so like the inmates rushed and, picked him up and called for help and saved his life. And, and I think that one of the things that I think drew so many people to this video is just this idea that I think people, especially in the United States, are, they commit a crime and we just send them away forever and just treat them like they're subhuman and that they're just rotten to the core, like there's nothing redeeming about them. And this was just, the perfect example of showing them like real live of like, these are people, right? These are good people that made a mistake. And I think when you see people through the lens of grace, you can see that. It doesn't mean that, like I said, doesn't mean people aren't accountable. I'm not saying let's have an anarchy and there are no laws and no one ever goes to jail or prison or anything like that. But I think if you were to look at a criminal justice system that was organized more around the idea of grace, you would see it the way I see it, I think, which is when somebody does something like this, when somebody breaks a law, when somebody harms another person, it's actually an opportunity for intervention. It's an opportunity to help this person go in a different direction because something brought them to that place. And I think when you see people through the lens of grace, you see that people are doing the best they can with what they have. And always, if you've read anything about the criminal justice system, always like the violent criminals have just the most horrific stories, right, of abuse and trauma. And so that doesn't mean they're adults. It doesn't mean they're not going to be held accountable. But if we hold them accountable with grace and treat them with humanity and, ideally help them reform their lives, that's a very different outcome. And I think that when we treat people with the inhumanity that we treat people who've committed crimes, it's harming us as well. It's not, you just can't treat people like that and not have it infect you as well.
And a nation, like I can't help but think as I listen to you that this Supreme Court decision just came down about the bomber from the Boston Marathon, right? Saying that they're going to uphold his
the death penalty.
His death penalty, which what effect does that have on a nation, right? That there's, and again, I'm not suggesting he doesn't deserve to pay a price or to, be accountable. But the very same people who talk about being pro-life, for instance, will be more than happy to say, put this guy to death. And I just don't know where grace exists in the middle of that.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. And it's, it's believing, and also the same people who my freedoms and the government is this and that. And it's like, you don't trust the government to tell you whether you should wear a mask, but you trust them to, tie somebody down to a table and inject them with some deadly drug. It's like you're literally giving them the authority to kill their own citizens. Like that's weird. Considering what you say you believe, the way they die is just horrific. It's absolutely horrific suffering. And it's this eye for an eye kind of mentality, and it does nothing. Like trying to teach people that killing is bad by killing people who kill people is not, it's a little bit of a
sorry to laugh,
fallacy.
but it sounds ridiculous.
Yeah,
it does. It's
very contradictory.
And so it's like, and then I think, I just think also, people claim the United States is a Christian nation, right? There's certainly a lot of Christians here. I don't think it's a Christian nation, but there are a lot of Christians here. And I would say as a Christian, and I don't know how anyone could ever argue against this theologically, you're the priest, so you can tell me if I'm wrong, but like you're interfering with, like, God is the judge, and you're interfering and saying, like, I don't trust God to judge this person, so I'm going to come in here. Like, you're not leaving any room for God to work on that person. And you're becoming like judge, jury, and executioner. And
exactly.
It's idolatry, really, to be honest.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because it's I spent the morning preparing a sermon on Sunday of Jesus' temptations and in the wilderness, and a lot of people know that story. And the second one was that Satan saying, "See all the powers and principalities, all the wonderful things. It's all yours. It's all yours." And the response is, "No, God has authority.
Right?
You don't go there." Right. So there you go.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting about what you said earlier, something along the lines of grace has a limit, and I think that's really interesting because you also write about how boundaries are critical for saving grace, and you write, it's wonderful to be empathetic and we need more empathy in the world, but what many of us call empathy is actually just an open door policy to toxic behavior that leads us burned out, that's an interesting distinction that you make. In writing about boundaries, you describe coming to grips with what you are a no to and how that helps you appreciate what you are a yes to. We've all struggled with making these and going through these uncomfortable family get-togethers or decisions being made about a friend, about a post that they made or something like that, or situation at work where opinions are deeply divided. It makes grace seem like a distant dream. You offer a counsel in that chapter where you talk about boundaries, about how to set these boundaries. Can you say more about boundaries and within grace?
Yeah. I think boundaries are grace. Yeah. It's like because it's because if you use boundaries, then you aren't going to go down the road of judgment. You aren't going to go down the road of demonization and all those other lovely things that we do to people, right? You're going to say, no, I'm not okay with that. You may say it, and you may just think it. It's, you don't always have to tell people because some people can't receive it. But if the person can receive it, you could say hey, I'm not okay with what you just said. And, I'm not going to have a conversation with you about this. It's not up for debate. Or I am going to have a conversation with you, but we are going to have some boundaries around how we speak to each other. The kinds of things, we're not going to yell. We're not going to speak to each other with contempt. We're going to listen. We're not going to interrupt, whatever it is. When you do that, you don't, or I should say, it's more like when you don't do that, what happens is you become resentful. And so you don't speak up, you don't say what your boundary is, but you sit there and you seethe over what Uncle Joe said about, Kamala Harris or whatever it is, right? And you're just, and then you take that with you and you start judging and you start that starts happening. Versus if you just are very clear about it, then you can just basically I'm a no to that. That's not for me. One of the things I say is figure out what your no is and then figure out what your yes is, because sometimes there's nothing we can do, right? You can say that to somebody and they're just going to become more combative. And so you just have to decide internally, I'm going in the other room. I'm not doing this or whatever it is. But what can you do where you don't feel so helpless, and you don't feel victimized, right, by the fact that you have to listen to this stuff? And what can you do to address whatever Uncle Joe was saying? And there's all sorts of things, and we don't realize how empowered we are. So, for me, I could write a column, right? I actually have a platform, and I could do something about it. Another person could write a letter to the editor, or you could volunteer, you could give money to an organization. That's, let's say he was saying something racist about Kamala Harris, you can give money to anti-racism organizations. You can amplify the voices of anti-racist teachers online. There's all these different things that we can do that we sort of forget about and instead become really entangled with that one person that's probably not going to change. Right. And it's maybe they will, but if they do, it's going to be over a long period of time. And so to instead just use boundaries and just say, I'm just this, I don't want to have this conversation, and I'm going in the other room, and or if you want to talk about something else, I'm happy to talk to you about it.
I thought one of the best examples you gave it at, actually beyond your column, is the way you've decided to comport yourself when you're on CNN and somebody is talking over you, for instance.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect example, because I was always being interrupted. I was often the only woman on the panel, and a lot of people will say like, oh, men always interrupt men, and I'm just going to say, I'm sorry, but like maybe they do, but they interrupt women a lot more. And there's a lot of social science on this. This is not, this is, when they have put groups of people in the room, women interrupt women more. So it's like, it's not that just men are, it's like women get interrupted more. That's just what happens. And so, I would often be like mid-sentence and someone would start talking, and you just would be like, I'm literally in the middle of a sentence and you're talking. And so I started just, I decided to start saying something about it. And, a lot of people online, people would always be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how much they interrupt you, And so sometimes I'd say, let me finish. And people were like, don't say, let me finish, say, because then you're asking for permission. Just tell them to stop interrupting you. So I actually started doing that, and I would stop and I would make it uncomfortable. I would be like, why did you just interrupt me? I mean, we're on live television. You know what I mean?
Right,
like, and
where are you
like,
going to go?
Like, make it uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And and say like, don't interrupt me. Like, I just do not interrupt me again. And pretty quickly it stopped. And the thing about it is before, I didn't really push back that hard on it, and I was just filled with so much resentment.
Right. Yeah, you carry it.
Yeah. And just so much resentment. And versus just saying it, and then the good news is that they mostly stopped doing it, and it almost never happens anymore. But it just never occurred to me to really set a boundary. I just, and I didn't really know anything about boundaries. I heard people say boundaries, but I didn't really understand what they were. And once I learned about them, it was transformative. I mean, I just can't even, in every part of my life, it's just changed so much. And it makes it so much easier for me to have grace or practice grace, because I'm not resentful. I like, people know, like, I used to think of boundaries as a way to kind of keep people away, like I'm going to put a wall around me and I'm boundary. And, boundaries are actually, you're actually telling people how to come in. So you're actually saying, like, if you want to be in this conversation with me, here's what you have to do. If you want to be in a relationship with me, here's the basic expectations that I have. And so I'm actually telling you how to be in a relationship with me. I'm not saying go away, I don't want to be in a relationship with you, or I'm not going to talk to you. It's just, I'm saying that I expect like just basic respect and and other things.
It does frustrate me personally that sometimes those boundaries have to be set when in reality they should be respected initially. Like, you really shouldn't interrupt anyone, full stop. Anyway.
Totally. I agree. No, I mean, and a lot of it is like, a lot of people's behavior is just, it's disrespectful, it's emotionally unhealthy. There's all these other things that you're just like, really, I have to explain this to you? You're like, you're an adult. But the reality is like, we do.
Yeah, I have to explain it to you.
It's also like it's a reflection of like how they were raised and things like that too. But anyway, that's a whole other podcast. It's actually time for a new segment called Listener Questions. And we have a question for you from one of our fantastic listeners. This is a question from Josie Woodavine.
Very close.
I hope that's right. She is a resident of London, and she goes to St. Aidan's Parish, and she's incredibly engaged in her faith, and Josie is often a powerful example of how to extend grace in the midst of difficult times, and this is her question for you.
Hi, Kirsten. Josie here, a fellow sister of Living in Grace, and I also have people who drive me nuts. So you write about the trauma you experienced after a series of deaths in your life, and how that trauma impacted your own life and your own behavior. Once you're able to see that more clearly, You note that you saw other people reacting in what seemed like a disproportionate or overly harsh way, and you reminded yourself that they might be having a completely unconscious response activated by their own past trauma, and you were able to show them more grace. Having gone through a string of great personal loss in my own life recently, I, along with others I'm sure who've experienced loss, would appreciate any advice that you can give on how to continue to have grace for myself and for all those around me. Thanks.
Yeah, well, she hit on something really important, which is having grace for yourself. And one of the things that I think a lot of people, if you're having trouble having grace for other people, you should stop and look at how you treat yourself. Because one of the first things I realized was I didn't have any grace for myself. And I was very, very hard on myself. So it's not surprising I was very, very hard on other people. Right. And I didn't, when I looked back over things I had done in the past and felt ashamed about them and angry at myself that I had done them or those kinds of things, I didn't say, oh, she was doing the best she could. Right. I had to have a therapist point that out to me, to say like, why are you judging like a past version of yourself? Like she was traumatized. And like she was literally doing the best she could with what she has. Like you're a different person now and you're judging her from a different place. And I was like, oh my gosh, and it really helped me because when I see other people, I can kind of be like, yeah, I remember that. Like I remember what that's like. And so much of what we do is unconscious. And particularly when we're traumatized, it's extremely unconscious. When you go into a fight, flight, or freeze, which are the various trauma responses, you're not even really aware of what you're doing. And so it made it a lot easier when I see people acting out to go, okay, first of all, don't engage with them because they're not in a good place. And then also just to be very clear about with myself about having grace for myself. And I have to say, compared to before I started the book to now, I used to have a really horrible inner critic. I was just so mean to myself, like the things I would say to myself, and it just does not exist anymore. I mean, I really cannot remember the last time that happened. And so, but I do believe that's because I dealt with my trauma. And, you can make the shift mentally, intellectually, but I do think you have to get to sort of the root of, because someone once said like that voice in your head, it's not just like some random voice, it's one of your parents. Or both of your parents. It's like, it's someone that, you know what I mean? And so you have to like heal from that and realize that your parents were doing the best they could and they were trying to make you a better person. But like, it's not helpful. It's not helping you. And so I think that, really cutting yourself some slack and realizing that you're doing the best that you can. And that's all any of us can do. It's like, and to kind of give up, perfectionism and all these other things, which is what I gave up for Lent. So, because it's hard. That's gonna take a while to completely disappear. But I think that, and I think, for the person who just asked the question, when you experience many losses, it's traumatic and that has to be integrated. And so, and that's what I discovered was that I never really knew how to grieve and I didn't really integrate it. I just kind of moved on. And so like you have to take the time to grieve and to feel it and cry and feel sad and feel despondent and all the things that I think a lot of times we just feel like I just want to get through this and get it over with. And if you do that, it'll come back to get you, unfortunately.
Well, I think that's a good segue to just my final question today before we wrap up our time, because you've been so personal and vulnerable in your book, and you have been with us today, and we appreciate that. And I wanted to read just a short excerpt again for our listeners and have a quick question for you. You write that this book is part of my attempt at amends and restitution. It's my offering to the world to try to help shift the way we think about and treat each other. to own in more detail some of my more regrettable moments and to apologize for them. I've also donated money to people and organizations that support the groups I harmed with my cluelessness and callousness and self-righteousness and privilege. Where it's been appropriate, I've made direct apologies. In the end, the process of repentance likely has changed me far more than it will change any other person who reads this book or to whom I've apologized. The fruit of this work is a changed heart and a changed woman who not only doesn't want to repeat the harms of the past, but is dedicated to creating wholeness in a fractured country. And Kirsten, you make clear that grace does not bypass accountability. We've said that today. And you have borne witness to how grace creates the space for repentance and repair and reconciliation, not just in yourself, but in others, into the community. So finally today, can you just maybe share with our listeners about that idea of repentance and forgiveness and why they're so critical when we have to talk about grace?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we alluded to it a little bit earlier, just that, we don't have a culture, again, ironically, in the United States, that because everyone claims to be, that this is a Christian country and that, and so many people are Christians, we don't have a culture of repentance. We have a culture of apologies, usually like workshopped apologies, right? That just are sort of supposed to get everybody off your back. Versus repentance, which is a changed heart, where you actually are so grieved by what you did and that you just want to make things right. And it's a multi-layered process. And I interviewed a rabbi who laid out sort of the Jewish understanding of repentance. It's pretty close to what the Christian understanding of repentance is, with a few little tweaks that people could see in there. But I think that, it's taking responsibility at the level that the harm was caused. It does involve amends. It does involve, because if you're truly repentant, you will want to make it better. So it just flows naturally out of it. So that's why when people do these kind of like, well, I'm sorry that you were offended and blah, 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 and go on their way, it's like, but that's not repentance. That's just an apology. And so, there has to be something that seeks to create wholeness where you caused brokenness. And, and I think that, and then I think we have to be a culture that actually is open to people being repentant, because let's face it, there are also a lot of people that are like, take your apology and shove it. You know what I mean? Like they don't want to hear it. They're just like, you're bad. And I am like sending you out into the desert and don't ever come back. So we have to be willing to welcome people back. We have to be willing to say, you did do something really bad, but we see that you are contrite and you've had a change of heart and you are now a different person and want to show up differently, and we're here for you, right? And that's also something that people don't want. They want to say, if you did it, you're bad, and you can never be good and you can never recover from it, which is just like, whoa. I say like, gosh, is that how you treat yourself? Because I hope not, because that is messed up. And unfortunately, I think it is how a lot of people treat themselves.
It's that I always have that image of the prodigal son parable of the father running out with the arms open. Like father running. Fathers didn't run back in those days, just running to say. So that talk about that welcoming and that repentance. It's powerful. Life changing.
What a very Lenten message for us. Like I mean, it's and the reality of, as it's in scripture, metanoia, right? The turning around. There's a physical shift that happens, right? It's not simply just continuing on in the same way. And I just found your words in there about your own accountability and your own willingness to sort of do something such an incredibly, I just read that and I thought, oh, this is a Lenten message right here. So I everything in the book, I mean, I just thank you for it and for all that you do, because again, like I said, what I appreciate is watching you and reading your columns and realizing that you don't need to say, well, now I'm going to testify about Jesus.
Exactly.
Listen to me, people. I've got the holy book. Let me hold it upside down for you.
Yeah.
But instead, what you do is you comport yourself in such a way that I'm proud to be a Christian,
Aw, that's
And-
so sweet.
And
So
so,
true.
because so many people comport themselves in such a way that I'm ashamed to be a Christian,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
your day-to-day work, it gives me hope that
Mhm.
Oh, thank you. That means so much to me.
there are people out there living this in such a way that they're trying to make real the way of Jesus, and you do that in what you do. So thank you.
And that's why we want
Thank
people
you.
to get the book, Saving Grace.
Yes, get the book.
Speak your truth, stay centered, and learn to coexist with the people that drive you nuts. And we
Yes.
know they're out there. So
Yeah.
this will be a great Lenten gift. For
This
someone.
actually, I should buy a case of these and give them to the people I drive nuts.
That's right. That's a good idea too. That's true repentance. True repentance. Kirsten Powers is our guest today at the Vickers Crossing. Thank you so much for your gift of time, your gift of this book, and we wish you every blessing and as you move forward. Okay, Kirsten, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, how lucky are we to be able to have Kirsten on the podcast, and someone that I always see on CNN and MSNBC, and here she is. So this was wonderful, and a wonderful writer and author and follower of Jesus. So it's wonderful to have her here. So I hope people pick up the book. It will be on our website, thevickerscrossing.com, with all the other authors and books that we've been talking to and about over the last little while. So if you're looking, if one struck you and you said, oh, where am I going to find that? You can find them all on our website.
Yep.
Thanks to our sponsors today as well, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. To Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. That's a wrap, guys. Thanks so much. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George here from St. Aidan's.
My name is Ian. Thank you for listening.
And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways before you cross that street.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!